Hey everyone, this is Louis7 and I once again have a Lord of the Rings online guide, and this one I am starting something new, which is going to be a general class building guide. And for the first one I am going to cover the Warden class. In a way, this general class guide is really supposed to go hand in hand with my detailed specialization guides, basically touching on the character building stuff that I don't cover in those, and covering things that apply to every spec like the class in general. And very notably, I will include a virtue section in these guides, which has been very often requested. But before that, I will have to go over stats, stat goals, and with going over the stats, I'll just naturally cover what you want on your gear, like what stats you want on your armor, jewelry, weapons, and that type of stuff. So this guide is really about building your character, and this episode it will be as the Warden class. Quickly, I want to point out a few things I will not be covering in this guide, and they are topics I would actually like to do for more complete class guide experiences in separate videos, but I will not be covering legendary items, and I will also not be giving like a general introduction to the class. I'll kind of assume you know some of the fantasy in this, or at least familiar with it. And additionally, I do have solid plans to next work on general class guides focusing on baseline and like the basics of the class's gameplay and game mechanics, along with an introduction and like really brief overview of each trait tree. So those type of guides would really give a complete experience and complete guide experience in a few different videos for each class. But I do want to give more background information on these guides in this new series, but I will save that for the end because it'll be a little bit long. So for anybody interested in that, I would love some feedback on the formatting of these guides and how I do my guides in general. So I really appreciate any comments on that. But again, I'll save the extra information for the end if anybody is interested in that. So to get back on track, the major goal of this guide and this new series will once again be to help players get started with building their characters and really just start off in the right direction, in addition to of course just learning more about the class. But I don't want to waste any more time, and let's get started with the Warden guide on stats, gearing, equipment, and virtue traits. Alright, so I am moving in-game here, and just to point out, the screen is going to be utilized a lot. I'll have a lot of the information panels up in the middle, and then my character sheet on the left, and then the trait tree panel on the right as we look at this stuff. And I also want to point out I'm on a very low level character, level 20, but because numbers get pretty insane at high levels, I thought it would be best to go on a low level character because it's easier to see what the stats actually give you at this level when you don't have that many stats to begin with. It'll also be easier to compare the virtues as well when we get to that. So before I get into the actual stats and how they apply with the Warden, I will assume you have a baseline understanding of how all these stats work. So like your offensive stats, your defensive stats, and also even the basic stats, I'll assume you have a general understanding of how those work. And in this video, I'm more interested in discussing how they're important to the Warden. So first off, we have might for our primary stat here, and this one will give us a little bit of physical mastering is the main thing from that. It'll give us 2 physical mastery rating per point of might, but compared to agility, which is our main stat, might could be considered a secondary stat kind of, but agility is our main stat. And yes, as it says, it's very important for you. And this one gives us 3 physical mastery rating per point of agility. And it also gives us 1 critical rating, so 2 things to boost our damage, and also a little bit of defensive stuff with 2 parry rating and 3 evade rating per point of agility. Briefly comparing agility to might, you will see of course that agility gives more physical mastery rating. Agility also gives critical rating compared to might giving nothing there. The defensive boost is actually pretty similar between the two, but I do want to point out very quickly that if you have a piece of gear, sometimes, especially at low levels, you'll run into gear with like might and agility. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you'll actually get a boost from the might, mainly with the physical mastery. You also might even run into pieces of gear with might on them that don't have agility on them, but they have enough secondary stats like critical rating and vitality and things like that, that you actually want a piece of might when it doesn't even have agility. And that's just something really I think you should keep in mind as you're leveling and gearing and just outfitting your Warden in general, because might does contribute a little bit of physical mastery rating. But moving on, we can talk about vitality, and of course this is pretty much the same for all classes. It gives us some morale and really allows us to survive better. And then we have will, which is the stat that Wardens don't want. It doesn't really give us anything useful. It does give tactical mitigation 1 point of that and gives 2 points of resistance rating, but this is definitely not something you want to seek out on a piece of gear. Otherwise, there is Fate for the last stat, and this one gives a whole bunch of things. First off, it does boost our offenses a little bit. It gives us 2.5 critical rating. And this reminds me, I am very sorry for missing this, but with Vitality, I didn't specifically mention that the morale it gives you is 4.8 as a Warden. That is a very weird number. It's not quite 5, but you can kind of think of it as 1 Vitality equals 5 morale. Anyway, to get back on track with Fate, that gives 2.5 critical rating per point of Fate and 1 point of finesse rating per point of Fate, so those will be nice for offenses, of course, but it also will give us a little bit of defensive boosts with tactical mitigation and resistance rating, 1 point each of those per point of Fate. And the other main thing Fate does is, of course, with the regeneration, it both gives you some in-combat regeneration. The main thing on that is we'll get some increased ICPR, which is the in-combat power regeneration, and that'll help us just sustain, use our abilities longer in combat without having to worry about power issues, of course, and also regenerate power out of combat. Moving on, I do want to point out some stat goals, or at least percentages you can look for in terms of offensive and defensive stats. So first off, we have critical rating here, and the baseline cap on that is 25%, so anything that gives critical rating won't allow it to go above 25%. If you do have something that boosts the percent critical chance, that will actually increase it up above the 25%. So this, our set bonus in the red line here, there's one called Precision Training, the third one, that actually gives us plus 2.5% critical chance, so that would allow us to go up to 27.5% critical chance there. So I did want to point that out, that's how that works. Also, Devastating Hit, the cap on that is 10%. Another thing critical rating does, which I'm not really supposed to cover this in this, but that does also increase the magnitude of our critical hits. Finesse is something you want about 25% would be a good target to start at. And that's a goal to really eliminate opponents blocking, parrying, evading, and resisting you. Otherwise, roughly 15 to 20% can be an okay starter amount, but really the goal, you should be looking more towards 25% with that. Physical Mastery for both ranged and melee, the baseline cap for that is 200%. Again, anything that increases percents in your traits and your set bonuses, anything at all that increases percent, even like stances. I'm honestly not entirely sure with the Warden. I should know if the stances do stuff, but anyway, the whole point is that anything like that can allow you to go above the percent, above 200%, but the rating won't. Tactical Mastery, this is actually something I want to touch on with the Warden. Wardens have a lot of skills that do light damage, so if I even look at on this character Warden's taunt, it says 75 light damage every 4 seconds, and normally something that's light damage would actually draw from Tactical Mastery on some other classes, but importantly for Warden, everything you do damage-wise, light damage even, that will draw from Physical Mastery, not Tactical Mastery, so don't need to worry about Tactical Mastery, and thought I'd just point that out. With defenses, this is generally true for most classes, but resistance isn't a good stat to rely on because it's just a chance that you'll completely negate the damage. In general, and LOTRO content is nowadays at least built towards mitigating critical hits and just mitigating the actual damage you take, not relying on chances to completely negate it. So with crit defense, Wardens are a little bit weak on crit defense even in the tank spec, so I did want to point that out, that it's just an unfortunate thing with the way content is built right now at least. A lot of the Warden tanking is actually based on your avoidances, so BPE and also self-healing, and again, that's just not the style of tanking that is viable right now, unfortunately, for Wardens. Also, their mitigations are a little bit weak, so Wardens use medium armor, so the mitigation cap for the Warden is going to be 50%, so you can reduce incoming physical damage by up to 50%, and tactical also 50%. And just to note, once again, anything that boosts percents will allow you to go above that 50%, so you even have some gambits. And I don't think I have the stuff on this character, unfortunately, to show it right now, but you do have some gambits. Actually, I can pull up the skill panel here and find it, but you have some gambits that can boost the percent higher. So like Impressive Flourish here gives physical and tactical mitigation rating, but it also gives the percent boost, which will allow you to go above the cap, and same thing with actually maddening strike there. 2-3 and 2-3-2, that whole chain will give you percent with the mitigations. And just to point out, this is a very general thing with the stat, but thought I'd mention it here. Orccraft mitigation and fell rot mitigation is a PvMP thing, so you don't need to worry about it for PvE. As far as building your mitigations, I do want to point out that tactical mitigation, this is just generally true across all classes actually, this is going to be the one that's hard to build, especially while leveling. Now at very high levels like level 100 plus, you will start to notice your physical mitigation starts to go down, but while leveling it'll actually be pretty close to the cap. I'm at like 40% here at level 20. But tactical mitigation is going to be the hard one, and in general just fighting enemies, if you come across a tactical enemy, they will probably do a lot of damage to you, so that's just something to be aware of, especially when we look at virtues. Moving on, we can talk a little bit about gearing, but we kind of covered most things. So in general with our main stats, again, agility and vitality are two main things, and those will be very common on gear pieces. So just looking at my random gear pieces on this level 20 character, it has like, the helmet has agility and vitality, and that's actually true for all my pieces here. And then some other stats they could have are like physical mastery, critical rating, there's even evade rating, tactical mitigation. For a secondary stat, I think one of these even has fate, again physical mastery. Looking at this ring, this is actually a good example of an offensive piece you might look for to boost your DPS. So it does have agility and vitality, but the main draw from that actually is the large amount of physical mastery and critical rating. Just to look at something like that, and then even some of the jewelry has like in combat power regen, so I should never have power issues on this character. And again, we have fate, so that gives us a lot of various boosts, vitality, and tactical mitigation. So you really have to weigh in on what is most worth it. In general, while leveling, I recommend looking at physical mastery, finesse, critical rating, vitality, and agility to like start off your offensive stuff. As far as mitigations, again, physical mitigation isn't something I don't think you have to worry about too much while leveling. Of course, if you're a tank and doing a lot of group content at mid levels, even high levels, and also while leveling, if you're doing that, having good physical mitigation, like close to 50% is a good thing. But even for a lot of stuff, it doesn't need to be all the way that high. But the main thing is really reducing the tactical damage you take and getting your tactical mitigation up. And that's, even though I do have a piece of gear with that on this character, that's something that will be a little bit harder, especially while leveling at low levels, kind of the emphasis here. That getting your tactical mitigation up maybe through virtues would be a good thing, as I mentioned earlier. But the other things I want to point out with the Warden is the Warden shield. So this at baseline always has armor and critical defense. As its stats, it often has block rating and a bunch of other things. Unfortunately, this character has a white shield, and I can't show all the fancy things Warden shield have on him. But that's what the Warden shield do. And I don't have the carving on this character. Okay, so I ran to the Warden trainer who has level 20 baseline carvings for me to show what they actually do. So the main thing with these is they actually reduce the power cost of whatever type of carving it is. So there are fish, shield, and spear type carvings. If I actually put all these up and anchor them, we can look at all them. But the main thing with them is that they have minus power cost with shield gambits. So any gambit that starts with like the shield builder, and then for the spear one, it's like any gambit that starts with the spear builder, and the same thing for the fist carving. In general, I like the fist carving because a lot of the gambits you use, especially while leveling and just through general gameplay, are going to be fist gambits. So that's often a good one to choose. Otherwise, these do have stats. Usually it is increased maximum power and vitality. Among other things, like high level ones, you might see tactical mitigation as a common one. Again, that's a good stat that we want to look to get to mitigate our tactical damage. There's also like percent light damage on some of them, so that's good for damage boost. So just things like that in addition to that. But I did want to show that because it is the Warden class item along with Warden shields. But the other thing is Wardens use javelins. So javelins at very baseline, they say wield, your ranged auto attacks are 5% tougher to block. So that's just something that's true with all javelins. Your ranged auto attacks just won't be blocked quite as much. That's not really too impactful, but it is something I want to point out. Otherwise, I think that is about it for gearing and equipment. Again, all of it comes down to what stats the gear pieces want and how you equip yourself with that. Really, we covered it by covering the stats, I think, at least. So now we are ready to cover the virtues, and I know my screen is even more crazy with all the tooltips I have open. So I actually don't have all the virtues open here to look at because I actually got an error that I had too many tooltips open. So very importantly, the virtues that are not up on the screen, you don't see the tooltips for them, like charity. These are ones you just generally don't want. They're very generally not going to be useful. But one thing with virtues I do want to point out is they are very flexible, and for different things you can do in the game, you want different virtues. So there's not like any universal 5 virtues you want on your Warden, no matter what spec really. So first off, we have our offensive virtues up here. You have some defensive virtues, good options down here in the middle, and then at the bottom there's also a loyalty. I'll talk about that one specifically. But the ones at the bottom right here, right under the virtue traits panel rather, these are ones that could be options, but in general aren't going to be that great. So the main ones we really want to choose from are these 10 rather, 2 sets of 5 in the middle. Again, the bottom 4 are defensive, loyalty is also defensive, and then your offensive ones are at the top. So at end game, the meta changes very frequently, and the exact virtues you want changes very frequently as well. It depends on the specific encounter you're in. Sometimes maybe you need tactical damage for a boss, but then the next boss you don't, so you just want to maximize on your damage. Things like that are pretty crazy with virtues, and that's one of the good things about their flexibility, but it can make it hard for especially like new players to choose which virtue they want. And like with the Warden, some people might recommend a bunch of offensive ones, maybe for leveling even, or other people might recommend getting like tactical mitigation, morale, and getting that type of stuff up your defenses, and maybe for tanking people I'd like ideally recommend that. So there's just a lot going on with virtues is what I'm trying to say. I haven't even talked about them, and I think we're like 2 minutes into this section already. But to start off, again, these are good offensive options, and I want to highlight that wit can be good at low level, because it gives finesse rating. You won't find too much gear with finesse at low level, so if you're trying to get your finesse up and doing low level content and maybe going through instances, especially at low level, that can be a good thing to start off with. Confidence is the only virtue that will primarily increase your critical rating, and it's actually pretty good at that, even though the tertiary stat there is evade rating. So confidence is a good one to choose, and I just remembered this. I'm sorry for forgetting to talk about this, rather, if I can get my words right. I have a general overview of how the new virtue system works. That was back during update 24 a couple years ago. I made a full video on that covering the system and how it works, and just generally about the virtues and what they're good for. If you do want to see that, you can watch that to get more of an understanding of what's going around here. But anyway, confidence is good for boosting critical rating. It's not one I often choose early on though. Otherwise, determination will be one that increases our agility as a main stat, and just to compare real quick, zeal gives us might instead of agility. So in general, we'd actually prefer determination over zeal if we're looking for something offensive. But if you go full offensive with every offensive virtue, that's when zeal can be good. So I actually should probably move it down to like with loyalty. We'll go ahead and do that right here to have that a little bit separate. But that was just earlier to group them as offensive virtues. But if you do equip all 5 virtues, you want all 5 of them offensive for whatever you're doing, zeal would be the 5th option for that, basically with Warden. Otherwise, for boosting, oh yeah, we have Valor as well, which increases our physical mastery. That's like raw damage. And I do want to point out that also does give us some finesse rating and critical rating, not too much of those though. Anyway, moving on, we have the defensive options, and Fortitude and Honor are very good at increasing your max morale, especially while leveling it at low level. These are actually the virtues that I'd like to level up on my characters first because they're very universal. Even at high level content and in-game content, having more morale is always going to be helpful to you, even as a DPS, just so you can survive stuff better. A living DPS is better than a dead DPS doing no damage. So yeah, Fortitude and Honor are really good ones to start off with. Also, while leveling and through a lot of content in LOTRO, as I mentioned, tactical mitigation can be hard to get, and tolerance and fidelity help with that, especially if you are a Warden tank while leveling. It's something to really consider. Even as a DPS Warden, just again to survive better, a lot of group content, if you do that, you will run into tactical mitigation, or tactical damage, which if you don't have your mitigations up can actually one-shot you or just very quickly make you go down. And once again, in a live Warden that does slightly less DPS is better than a dead Warden that does no DPS. And just to point out, if you are leveling just going through the game solo on your Warden, tactical mitigation probably won't be as useful for you, so you probably won't even want to consider tolerance and fidelity. But moving on, the other two kind of options, we already talked about zeal, but loyalty. So if you're thinking in terms of raw morale, fortitude and honor will be better. Loyalty only gives 3 vitality, which could be roughly equated to 15 morale, compared to fortitude and honor, which are almost twice as much. So these are going to be more effective at increasing your morale. And also to point out, loyalty does give armor and incoming healing rating, but that is less significant than the vitality portion of it. So again, to get started, I personally would recommend fortitude. Where should I move these? I'll move my character sheet up and move the ones I would start off with. Fortitude and honor, those are just 2 very good ones to start off with. And then I would also do wit as kind of the other thing I work on, depending if you want more offensive, if you want finesse, you could go with that. But these are just very universal things that, again, as I have talked about. And here you can choose the next 2 really based on what you want. I would, if you just want offensive stuff, I would recommend confidence. And then you could choose between determination and valor. In terms of what you get, valor will give you more mastery overall, but with the agility you get from determination, it'll just be slightly more flexible. So as a general thing, determination can be very slightly better with that, but valor also provides stuff, so it's really up to down to what you want with your character. Unfortunately, I don't have the perfect answer here, so you could go with valor or determination for that. If you wanted something offensive, it could look like this as the 5 virtues you would work on. So I'll just let that sit there a minute, and I'll go ahead and move the other 2 offensive options we chose to highlight some defensive options, which, yeah, that's right. You could go with tolerance and fidelity if you plan to run a lot of group content, especially low-level group content. This is kind of the standard setup I just universally use on all my characters, not just Wardens actually, because getting, again, that tactical mitigation will help me survive stuff, and also get the very universal morale increase, and also wit just to help a little bit with the offensives. But otherwise, you could sub in loyalty. If you want to increase your morale even more, you could put loyalty in maybe one of the offensive ones or even one of the tactical mitigation ones. You don't necessarily need both of those. Again, if you want another offensive option, I wouldn't recommend zeal. That was only if you want all 5 offensive virtues, which is something if you want that, if you want just more damage out of your virtues. It is, of course, something you can do. But I think that generally covers what I would recommend. We didn't actually do the all defensive option. So the all defensive option, of course, is taking wit out and having these 5 virtues, your morale ones, your vitality one, and your tactical mitigation ones. But what you all have probably noticed is I haven't talked about, as I move these back, I haven't talked about the 4 virtues on the bottom right of the screen. So these are options if you specifically need what these virtues give. They are options that can be okay. So idealism usually actually isn't that good, but if you want just what fate universally gives you and a little bit of incoming healing rating, that can be an okay option, but in very general, I wouldn't recommend that. So I'm actually going to go ahead and exit out. I just want to point that out. And that's the same thing with empathy. If you really want to get your armor up, which increases your physical mitigation, and your tactical mitigation, and get some crit defense, it can be an okay option. But in general, that's another one I would recommend avoiding and choosing something a little bit more effective. But with empathy, it actually is more useful than the other one. I will leave it up just to point that out. I'll go way on the right there. But if you need physical mitigation, compassion and innocence can be good. At very high levels, you might run into content if you're somehow tanking as a Warden and actually doing it okay with The issues with Warden tanking, again, content is based not really around the strengths of Warden tanking. Warden tanking is AoE tanking, self-healing, and avoidances, which content is more based on crit defense, mitigating critical damage, and instead of avoiding all attacks, just mitigating what you actually take. But anyway, off of that sidetrack, that is when you might want Compassionate Innocence to boost your physical mitigation if you need that. Otherwise, that I think is it for the virtues. Again, anything I did not have up here is just like not worth considering at baseline. Like just patience, this is a very easy one to pick on. Maximum power is probably the most useless thing on any sort of anything in LOTRO. It's just very useless as a stat. In combat power regen is insanely more effective, and even in combat power regen is something that's nice to have a little bit of, but you don't even need too much of it, just a tiny bit of it, enough to keep your power up in combat and you're good. And even the evade rating, again, that's not going to provide much. The critical rating, that is a tertiary thing on that and kind of odd to throw in there. So patience is a virtue, but a very bad one. Anyway, I think that covers the virtues. This type of guide and going over this is very odd to me, so it just feels a little bit weird as I'm going through this. But anyway, I'll go ahead and get shifted out of the live commentary and go to background gameplay and have a little bit more structure to this. Alright, that was it as far as the guide goes. Again, this one specifically just covering building and having all those UI panels open and stuff like that was a bit new to me. So please do excuse any messes, and as usual, feedback is appreciated. But anyway, I hope this guide itself on stats and virtues was helpful and you learned something about the Warden with it. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, but I'm not done yet because, as I mentioned in the beginning, I want to discuss some more details on the background of this guide and some follow-up guides and just general update on my guide work in general. So I do appreciate anybody that bothers to stick around and listen to this part, and once again, would further appreciate any input. So as I was working on my detailed specialization guides and rebooting that, I had to think of how I would format those. It turns out I think it makes most sense to do it the old way I was, with just more emphasis on those guides actually being detailed class trait analyses, and also expand the gameplay section even more. One thing that was often requested was guides on virtues, but as we saw throughout this guide, is virtues are very odd because they are extremely flexible on how you use them, and they apply like very generally not only within a class but between all classes actually. So I don't think there is ever like a situation where there are any 5 like perfect virtues for any class where you may like never consider any other options. That's just not really a thing. So I thought it would be better to cover these virtues in a separate guide, which is the guide you saw today. With my very broad goal to eventually have guides that cover every aspect of each class, I thought it was a good opportunity to include relevant information on stats and the general things that build your character up. This is really about character class building, and that really is just stats, gear, and virtues outside of class traits and notably race traits, which I did not cover today. So that one is a bit odd because it would be quite difficult to analyze those for each class on each race. Rather, I would ideally do it the opposite of that, the reverse, and talk about the racial traits. The racial traits for each race rather than which classes those may or may not be effective for, and go from there. But with this guide I did today, I actually originally planned for it to also contain what will now be a separate self-contained guide on basic gameplay mechanics and an overview of each trait tree specialization and what they do. But it turns out that is a way different topic than what we covered today and basically irrelevant again to what we did today, so I decided that would be its own guide. So that is how this guide got started and why it is the way it is, but in summary, we will have for each class a detailed guide on each specialization with the trait trees and building options and gameplay within the spec, that type of stuff, and then a 7 tips class guide that just gives 7 tips I have to hopefully better your experience on whatever class. Then we have a guide like this one overviewing other aspects of building for the class as a whole with stats, gear, equipment, and virtue traits. And then for the guides I have not done yet, I plan to do a guide covering basics of gameplay and gameplay mechanics as it applies to all specializations, and then give an overview of each specialization and some of the gameplay emphases. The ones I have more loose plans for include a general introduction to the class that would cover more like what the class is about, what the class fantasy is, what role they serve in the game, and that sort of baseline class introduction type information that isn't really about building or the actual gameplay, that type of guide. But then finally, the other thing I'm thinking is a legendary item guide for each class, and that one is a bit tough and not something I'm actually immediately planning on doing, especially with the legendary item revamp on the horizon. I'd rather just wait for that before I cover anything with those. But alright, that is the structure of my class guides, and the eventual goal really is to be able to cover all those aspects of each class and have all that like nice and finished, but stuff does take a long time and just so many like guides for me to do, and then there are updates that change stuff and I'd have to make updated versions. So I guess the point here is that I will be super busy with guides in the future, which is okay because they're fun for me to make, but sometimes they do get a little bit slow to particularly get started like this one. And especially that's true because I want to be 100% sure I'm giving the right information in them. Anyway, the last thing I want to cover here is just give a status update on my guides progress. I started my new set of guides off with the yellow line Runekeeper, then I covered the yellow and blue line for the hunter. I already had a few of those detailed trait guides done before that are mostly up to date, like before my YouTube break I mean, and those are in my class guides playlist if anybody is interested in that. But I also did a 7 tips guide on the Runekeeper, and more recently did one on the Warden as well. I also at some point before this video did a red line burglar spec guide, and I think that was all that I have done before this one. We'll see exactly with the way I edit stuff if that's how it will be. But as far as where I am going next, I plan to touch up on the Warden next for the red, blue, and yellow line, knocking out all 3 of those at once. And I also would like to visit classes I haven't done much on. So for example, the Redline Minstrel build is over 3 years old, so I feel like I need to update that one. I know the Champion and Old Hunter one, the Redline Hunter one, those are a bit outdated even if the actual builds themselves haven't changed much. And I also want to do Guardian Red and Yellow Line, but I realize I'm actually getting way off track here with so many of these that I'm just listing out. So after I get a baseline set of those spec guides, I will start to shift to these more general character building guides like this one, and potentially, depending how they go, do more of the general gameplay and mechanics and spec overview guides after that. And that is the progress I have and where I'm going in the future, I guess. I spent extra long on this topic, just about this guide and my guides in general, because it was again at the end of this video, not like at the beginning before the actual guide happened. So I felt like I was free to spend a lot of time talking about my guides and where they are going and just give you all the information on them. Otherwise, for now, I will just continue making guides in the future and will likely give a status update as we head into 2021 in a few months as like its own video. And now the video and guide is done for reals this time, so if you enjoyed the status update and the guide itself, please do consider liking and subscribing for more once again, or becoming a channel member to support the content, and thanks for watching everyone.